The views and opinions expressed on any program are those of the producers and/or the persons appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of FRC Media, Bristol Community College, or the City of Fall River.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Bristol Legal, where we bring you legal issues that are relevant to you and your communities. My name is Elizabeth Nowakowski. I'm the professor and program chair for the Paralegal and Legal Studies at Bristol Community College. And I'm very excited about our guest today to talk about a topic that is very, very much in the news lately, immigration. Our guest today is Dr. and Professor Roni Amit from UMASS Law School. She is also a director of the Immigration Law Clinic at the law school. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
So there's so much to unpack about immigration. Part of me doesn't even know where to start because there is sort of the historical background, there is the law, there is politics, there is just what's happening in the news today. But I thought we'll just start with the basics. For those who may not know much about immigration, maybe we can start about, tell us how an individual can gain legal status in the United States. So what is sort of the path to, I guess we call it residency or legal or citizenship? What are different ways that people can come here lawfully and be documented?
So there's two main pathways that people can get permanent residency in the country. First is through a family-based visa, and those are really for immediate family, and there are different waiting periods for those. So for sibling visas, those can take many, many years because these visas are capped. And then there's also employment-based visas, where if you meet specific criteria and your employer can make a case for why they need to hire you and why they can't hire someone, an American citizen, then that's another pathway. And then beyond that, really the third way is through asylum. If you can show that you are facing some sort of threat, there's specific criteria you need to meet, so not everyone who is facing a threat to their life would necessarily qualify for asylum. But if you do get asylum, then that's another pathway to permanent residence.
So that, thank you. So that is, let's talk about the asylum a little, because that is sort of, it's really hard not to talk about it in light of what's happening in the country, in the United States right now. This is early February, so that's been in the news for the last, I don't know, how long has it been? 6 months, maybe longer, So if we go back to the asylum discussion, which you mentioned, how long does it take right now for an asylum claim to be adjudicated or decision to be made on an asylum claim? On the average, I guess. I'm not sure if anyone knows.
So that really depends a lot on when you entered the country, where you are in the process, and whether you are filing an affirmative asylum claim, which you would file with USCIS, and that's a non-adversarial asylum hearing, or really an asylum interview, or a defensive asylum claim, which means you are in removal proceedings in immigration court, and then you're having your asylum hearing in court, and it's adversarial, so there's an ICE attorney on the other side. There is a huge backlog in the immigration courts right now. The last I heard is that it was over 3 million. And so people are waiting many, many years. There's constantly revisions and reforms. So if you got into the system more recently, you actually may be heard more quickly than someone who has been in the system for a while. Same thing if you want an asylum interview with USCIS. It can take many, many years that you're waiting for that interview date.
So 3 million, that's incredible. That's a huge number. I didn't realize that was that many. And that number is growing because I think we have approximately 6,000 people per day crossing the border right now. Is that the number that you've heard?
I have heard various numbers. I'm a little cautious about trusting those numbers because a lot of those people are repeat entrants, so they're counting people more than once. They've also increased enforcement and apprehensions, so it's hard to really contextualize those numbers.
Okay, that's a very interesting. How do we get to the point where we have so many people crossing the border? Can you give us some, I don't know if is it political context, historical context, because I don't think that was happening 2 years ago, right? So we didn't have that. I mean, we had the caravans and whatever was happening many years ago. But when did this happen? When, if you could give us some context.
So I think there's a few things going on. I think, first of all, globally, sort of looking in historical context, numbers always ebb and flow. And I've seen data analysis that shows that these numbers really are in line with historical trends, and if you look at it in relative terms as a percentage. But what is happening is that we are seeing an increase in the numbers of forced migrants. Those are people who are forced to flee, who are in need of protection, seeking asylum, seeking refugee status. And that's a global trend. And so I think the southern border reflects that global trend. And that's really just a function of what's happening in various countries around the world, countries that weren't necessarily sending refugees in the past, countries like Venezuela, Colombia, Nicaragua, that now are accounting for some refugee flows and migrant flows.
So it's not necessarily that someone opened the border, it just we have more people coming in.
Right. And in fact, I think it's significantly harder to get into the country at this point.
Yeah. So, let's step back and talk about the immigration law overall and the enforcement and all so on, because it's a federal law. But we know that the immigration law, I mean, so many presidents would have tried to make or reform it or change it over the years. I think the last one was it President Clinton that made a major significant statutory change? I'm not sure if I'm correct, or is that correct? Or?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a few. I would say the last really significant one was in 1986, which had both increased legalization measures and also balanced with increased enforcement measures.
Okay.
And then you had more limited reforms in 1990. That's where you saw the introduction of TPS and some changes to the immigrant and non-immigrant visas. And then, yeah, there was another reform in, I believe it was 1996, and that was really very enforcement based. So that really increased the enforcement side of immigration.
That was the one where if someone overstayed the visa, they couldn't re-enter for 10 years. Is that the one that?
That created some re-entry laws.
Okay, I just sort of. Can you, for those viewers who may not know, can you just tell us about TPS and what it is? I know it was in the news recently because President Biden had passed an executive order for a group of, migrants from certain countries. But can you just explain what TPS is about?
So TPS, it stands for Temporary Protected Status. And it really only applies to people who are already in the U.S. So if you are in the U.S. and something is happening in your country, the government can designate your country as qualifying for TPS. And that means that you can qualify for this temporary status and remain in the U.S. during the period designated by the U.S. government as some sort of instability, or sometimes not. It's used for when there's a natural disaster in a country, but it is not a pathway to permanent immigration or permanent residence.
So TPS could be granted for those who are here, who are documented or undocumented, right? Like it could be someone who is here without permission, or like
yes.
Yeah.
So it is a pathway. If you're already in the country, whether you're documented or not, it is a pathway to temporarily regularize your stay here.
So when we go back to it being federal law, we have two players. We have the executive branch, which is the president, and then within the branch, executive branch, we also have the agencies, which one of them is, I think, ICE, which falls within Homeland Security. Is that correct? And ICE stands for. Immigration and Customs
Enforcement.
Enforcement.
Yes.
Thank you.
I think so.
So we have ICE and we have the president. And so we have these reforms that that you mentioned that been sort of happening over years, not frequently, but we have laws on the books. And that does not mean, even though the statutes have not been updated, that does not mean that changes have not been made, right? Because the ICE as an agency, they have some leeway to change or no some of those rules and regulations, and then if we can also talk about executive orders that the president has power to pass, like how can these agents, the executive branch, make some changes to the immigration laws, if any?
So they're not really changing the laws. There is also CBP, Customs and Border Protection, which is on the right. They are responsible for enforcement at the border, and then ICE is responsible for enforcement in the interior.
Okay.
So the executive cannot, right, they're all part of the executive branch. The executive cannot change the laws. What the executive can do is exercise discretion and create enforcement priorities. And so that's really sort of what's been very contentious in the last few years, is when you see these executive orders and things like DACA that have been challenged, is that just changing an enforcement priority, or is that conferring some sort of new benefit that arguably would require legislative change?
And that's why DACA, for example, was challenged when it wasn't really challenged until President Trump wanted to revoke it, right? I don't think it was a challenge. I'm sort of digressing because I think DACA sort of is no longer applicable, right? It's sort of a closed.
So it's not open to new applicants,
that's what it is.
But it hasn't been entirely struck down. It's in the courts right now.
Okay.
And that's really the question, is it just reflective of an enforcement priority? There was first a challenge that they didn't implement it properly in terms of the federal regulations for changing the rules, and so they corrected that. And so now really the question is this beyond the scope of the executive's power to confer
And if you could
this?
just remind our viewers, what does DACA stand for? I know
It's Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals.
Okay, and this was for, it was an executive order that President Obama passed, right?
Yes.
If I'm not mistaken, that would allow those children that came within certain period of time, who didn't reach they were within certain age, they would get an opportunity to to work and go to school, right? They had a work permit, I think. Right? There were just some benefits. It wasn't a path to citizenship, right?
It's not a path to citizenship, and it's really, it was intended for people who were brought here as children by their parents. So really had no control over the fact that they were in the country was the idea behind it.
So it's really, excuse me, it's really hard not to mention the southern border right now because of what's happening. You mentioned that it's actually harder to get in the United States through the southern border than it was before. We do have the wall, part of it. I don't know, do you remember how many miles of the wall we have now that's been built? I don't remember.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, but is there, I know that there is a bill in Congress which, as of today, which is, today's the 6th of February, it doesn't appear that it's going to pass. But in that bill, there was a proposal to tighten the time limit for asylum processing, which is really interesting since you mentioned there were 3 million applications, more or less, of backlog. And do you know anything about the proposal? And is there any chance that, based on what your expertise, is there any way that even if the bill doesn't pass, that portion of the bill could somehow make it through somehow on its own to the immigration part of it?
Yeah, so I just want to clarify the backlog at the courts, it's not all asylum claims.
Okay.
That's just anyone who has a case before the immigration court.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
But there is, still a significant backlog in asylum cases. I think it's important maybe to understand what's happening right now in terms of asylum claims at the border, and then think about what is proposed at the bill. So in the bill. So right now there's really 2 ways you can seek asylum if you're at the southern border. The first way is through the CBP-1 app, which is an app that you have to log on to get an appointment to go to a port of entry as an asylum seeker. That app is very problematic. It's got a lot of technical glitches. It's really hard to get on. You have to be within a certain proximity of the border, and the number of appointments are capped. So people spend significant periods of time at the southern border, waking up at 4 in the morning, trying to get an appointment day after day after day. Conditions at the border are pretty precarious. They're not particularly safe, not to mention the fact that people often will get robbed on their journey, and so they won't have their smartphones to even be able to get onto the app. So if you decide that you can't wait for an appointment through the CBP-1 app, you can enter irregularly, like not through a port of entry, and then when you're apprehended, and often these people will still nonetheless approach a CBP official and hand themselves in, and then you're subjected to a credible fear interview, which is really a sort of pre-screening for asylum to show that you do have some asylum claim. You could potentially bring an asylum claim. But because you entered irregularly, you are now subject to the circumvention of lawful pathways rule, which means that if you did not seek asylum in one of the countries you transited, you are not eligible to apply for asylum. And that decision is made with no consideration of what your actual asylum claim is. It's just that you entered irregularly and you didn't seek asylum in one of the countries you transited. So then you're only eligible for lesser forms of protection. So that's really what's happening right now at the border. I think the proposed bill wants to speed up the process so that when you have the credible fear interview, it's done by a USCIS officer, and that officer can also hear your asylum claim. So the idea is that it would happen much more quickly. That's problematic because it limits access to counsel. Asylum claims for someone without a lawyer are really hard to put on. People don't really know what's required. They don't have time to gather evidence. They're often still suffering from the trauma of crossing the border, where they may have been subjected to various types of crimes. And so it's really problematic to expect someone to be able to put on their full asylum claim at that stage.
That's very interesting. In terms of, so you mentioned that some of those individuals who come through irregularly, because of the procedural, not validity of their asylum claim, but because of the procedure, they didn't apply for asylum, let's say in Mexico or in other countries. So therefore, so what happens to them? Are they allowed to come into the country, or they're sent back?
So if they pass the credible fear, and I think it's a slightly higher threshold of reasonable fear, then they are allowed to enter the country. They're put in removal proceedings, and they do have a hearing before immigration court, but they're not eligible for asylum. They're eligible for withholding of removal, which is the same criteria as asylum, but a slightly higher burden of proof that you have to meet, and that, unlike asylum, is not a pathway to permanent residence.
What's always fascinated me is the fact that individuals who, even yourself mentioned that they may not even have cell phones, we don't know where they're going to live. They don't know where they're going to live. They don't have resources. They don't have cell phones, and then we somehow are supposed to give them a date. Like how logistically, how does it work? How do they ever find out that they have a hearing? Like, how are they supposed to keep in touch with the immigration officials to know that they have a hearing when often they're coming in with nothing?
So what is supposed to happen is that they get a notice to appear that tells them the date of their hearing and the date and time and location of the hearing. In the past, this has been very problematic because they would get notices to appear that would say date and time TBD. That went through the courts. It was ruled unlawful, and so now they are required to have a date and time. Usually, ideally, it would be based on where they think they're going to go, because usually they have a destination in mind if they have family or someone in the country. And then they can change the location if they end up moving to another part of the country. But yeah, it is very problematic, and people don't always get notification of their court hearings.
That's, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned earlier the global crisis, immigration crisis, because it's, I'm not sure how many of our viewers are aware that, you know, Europe is struggling with very similar issues because of the immigrants coming from the south, right, from the African continent. And I think it is a global issue. And where, I mean, where is it stemming from? Is it, I know it's a very broad question.
Yes.
You know, I don't know how to even answer, but what are your thoughts on it? I mean, is there anything, maybe it's very theoretical answer, right? Like in a perfect world, you know, what do you think? Where do you see it going? I mean, this is not going to end. I guess, you know, the issues, I assume that whatever the issues are that causing these, you know, this migration, this huge migration of people across the world, those issues are not resolved, so the migrations are not going to go away. So where does it leave us?
Yeah, I mean, I have a few thoughts on
please.
that.
Please share.
I mean, one thing I think it's important to keep in mind that as much as this gets framed as a crisis, a migration crisis, the US and Europe are not where the majority of migrants are going. It's countries in the developing world. It's countries in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East, who are really receiving the largest numbers of migrants, the largest numbers of refugees.
Really?
So, yeah. So when I lived in South Africa for several years, the time that I was there, they were the top global recipient of asylum seekers in the world. I think now Jordan has a large number. Kenya has historically had a large number. So as much as we talk about the migrant crisis, we are not bearing the brunt of it. I think a few other factors. One is our labor market really depends on this migrant labor, but our legal system does not reflect that reality. And so a lot of people in this labor market, in this labor system that we're really dependent on, do not have a pathway to regularize their status. Another factor is because we make it so hard for people to come into the country, once they're here, they're not going to leave. If we enabled those flows back and forth, then people would go back to their countries. They would travel back and forth. That would also have economic benefits in the countries they're coming from. Remittances are a huge part of development in many countries. So recognizing that and allowing that to happen more easily. And then I think, right, other factors, climate change is going to have an effect on people needing to leave their countries. And then also some of the economic conditions that are a historical product of colonialism, and some of the economic relationships that developed that have continued. And so you're seeing countries where people are not really able to develop economically, and that incentivizes migration.
It's going to be very interesting to watch what's happening in light of the upcoming election, what's happening in Europe with the war in Ukraine, Middle East, 2 million people in Gaza who have no place to go. It's going to be something to watch and see how it's going to impact the rest of the world. Before we finish, I cannot not talk about the legal issue that is happening at the border, or the sort of the dispute that the governor of Texas has with the federal government. Can you speak a little about that? I mean, it's the U.S. Supreme Court actually sided with the federal government, but can you just sort of talk about that a little, the sort of the state versus federal government I'm talking about the wires
Right.
and the border. If you could just say a few words about that, because I find it fascinating that the state is trying to take ownership and say, we need to defend ourselves, which I understand from the point of the view of all the individuals coming through that one state. So I see their point, but if you could just talk about the state versus federal, I would appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few different things Texas is doing. And other states have tried this in the past. Arizona also tried to enforce immigration on its own. But the courts have consistently been very clear that immigration enforcement is exclusively in the power of the federal government. And states really do not have the power to enforce immigration law. So various state initiatives have been struck down over the years, just like we see with this Texas one now. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how Texas responds, but the bottom line is states do not have the authority to enforce immigration law.
Thank you. Do you have any last thoughts for us on immigration? Anything that I have not touched upon? Because there's so much.
Right.
I'm feeling I probably missed something really big.
I mean, I guess one other important point to make on the asylum issue is that people who are fleeing for their lives they're not gonna be deterred. Deterrence and enforcement measures are not gonna work when someone is fleeing from a threat to their life in their home country. And I think we saw that even with the family separation. It didn't really deter people from coming, because if you are risking death, if you stay, nothing is going to stop you from attempting to come. So when we increase enforcement and deterrence measures against asylum seekers, all that really does is increase the human cost and increase the levels of suffering.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. We will do it again, because there is always something to talk about on this issue. Thank you so much for watching. Till next time.